So on behalf of the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development, I would like to welcome all our, first of all, our distinguished speaker, Dr. Holly Hanson, and all our participants who've joined us for this lecture, both on Zoom as well as on Facebook, where this is being broadcast live. This lecture is part of a series of lectures that the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya University in Indore is organizing, looking at the various facets of development. The series is called Dialogues on Development, and we are fortunate to have Dr. Hanson, who is a renowned historian, speak to us for our session today. She will speak on the theme, Durational Ethics, Finding the Courage to Place Development Efforts in Time. A very unique and timely subject that I think is very much the need of the hour. An absence of historical context, as we know, can undermine the effectiveness of development efforts, but recognizing the weight of the past can also be overwhelming. This lecture uses an analysis of endeavors to secure rural prosperity in various parts of the world over the past century to propose durational ethics and deliberate learning as a way out of this dilemma. Professor Holly Hanson is Professor Emeritus of History at Mount Holyoke College, where for more than 2 decades her research and her classes have focused on the questions raised in this lecture. She has authored 4 books which explore the strategies and perspectives useful for development and which look specifically at people creating well-being in the history of Uganda. Her most recent book, To Speak and Be Heard, Seeking Good Government in Uganda, is a 500-year history of indigenous African institutions of political accountability. She is exploring the concept of durational ethics as part of a new research project on patterns of rural prosperity over the long term. Before inviting Professor Hanson to share her comment, I wanted to just mention to our participants that she will, after her address, which will go for around 40 minutes, we will have time to take your questions and comments. So please post your comments and questions in the Q&A box, which you can see on your screen, and we will be sure to raise them during the time allotted. So over to you, Dr. Hanson.
Yes. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I really appreciated having the opportunity to think about the subject, and I look forward to learning from other participants later. And also, I wish I could come in person. So let's think about that for the future, because I wish I could be with you. So this is a talk about placing development efforts in time. And I think to place ourselves in time seems very logical. It's rational. The past made the conditions in which we live, and the actions that we take will make the future. But what I want to suggest is that in the endeavor of development, we haven't done that. There is a kind of a disconnect between the things that we engage in, that we work really hard to do, and what was the cause of the conditions that we're trying to fix. We sort of like don't draw the lines between what made it happen and what we're going to do about it. And there's also the same kind of fuzziness about time in thinking about what will be the consequences of the actions that we take. Is what we're doing that we're doing with pure intentions and deep commitment? Will the consequences of what we're doing actually have the effect that we intend? Economic anthropologist Jane Geyer wrote a pretty famous essay about this. Her essay was called Prophecy and the Near Future. And in it, she points out that many contemporary habits of thought and action don't actually connect current actions to either the past or the future. She was an economic anthropologist and economic historian, and she particularly looked at monetarist or neoliberal economic policy and also at religious fundamentalism. And what she said was these ways of thinking and acting, which seem really different, religious fundamentalism and neoliberal economics, actually engage with time in the same way. That the near future is evacuated. There isn't a near future in the way that people are acting. They're thinking, we take these actions in monetary policy, or we take these actions as believers, and then in a distant future, there will be a result that is the result we want, without connecting the dots of the actions to the immediate consequences of those actions. And I think that analysis is really relevant to development and the challenges of development. So I thought that I would, as I went back to read her essay to talk about it, I found that she had also actually written an earlier one about this subject, in which she defined a term, durational ethics. She defines durational ethics as the prospective sense of taking responsibility for a situation, domain, or activity, going forward towards some kind of benchmark in the future, whether immediate, near, far, or eternal. So I thought, let's take this idea that thinking in time isn't just a good thing to do because we get good results, but thinking in time is a kind of moral capability, and a moral capability that we can cultivate. And if we think about the endeavor of development and try to think about it with this moral capability of durational ethics, what do we get? I'm going to do this in 3 parts. One is it's important, and if we just do a quick review of the history of development, we see that we are not doing a good job of placing development in time. Then I'm going to talk briefly about why it's hard to do. And then I'm going to sketch out some elements of a durational ethics. Okay. If we think about the development decades, the development as an endeavor is usually thought of as beginning with the end of colonial rule after World War II, and if we even think about it that way, we can see it's disconnected from the past. Because what about all of those centuries when much of the Indian subcontinent and all of the African continent, except for Liberia, this century in Africa, but longer in Asia, where communities didn't have autonomy and their economies weren't being developed for their own benefit? Why do we start thinking about development after that happened? There's a disconnect there. And that first development decade, the 50s or 2 decades and 60s, had a theme of industrialization. So people were looking at Europe and the United States and saying, in order to have the prosperity that these places have now, first they had to industrialize. Population had to move out of agriculture into industry. So that was the first effort, and we can see, for example, in Uganda, which is where I have done most of my research, there was an effort to dam the Nile and create a source of electricity for industrialization, which did happen. Electrical capacity was created, industries were created in Jinja. The funding for electrification in Uganda was higher taxes on rural farmers, which was okay because what was imagined was moving those people out of agriculture into industrial work was going to make the country richer. So by about 1970, when people looked at industrialization as a focus of development, they saw that it didn't work. Industrialization, and then also in some parts of the world, land reform. It had not had the consequences that people thought that it was to have. And so there's a switch, and we can see this from the top of this endeavor in the language of the World Bank towards thinking about poverty. And in fact, the word poverty isn't in the index of a 900-page history of the World Bank's actions for its first 20 years. Poverty was not what they were thinking about. But a new president, Robert McNamara, who changes the direction of the organization and says we have to think about poverty. And so the next decade was characterized by large-scale integrated development projects. And one of the things we see here is we see people learning. There is learning. They learned that industrialization didn't work. They didn't put it into time. They didn't place their actions in time, but they did learn industrialization didn't work. So what we can see in the 70s is these really large-scale integrated rural development projects. A World Bank historian writes about them and says, they were intended to lift entire regions out of poverty, and they did it in this multi-sector way because part of the bank's goal was to move a lot of money and to offer something to different ministries in the borrower states. Again, it's not placed in time in terms of what came before, but it's also not placed in time in terms of what would come afterwards, because lots and lots of money, there's really expensive input into small regions, and that at the end of the project it ends. And I'm going to quote here a Maasai farmer who describes it. And this comes from a work by Dorothy Hodgson. And part of what she says is the point was in this great big the Maasai Livestock Development and Range Management Project, which is like many, many others. She says the purpose is that the Maasai would change aspects of their lives, including their semi-nomadic movements, their livestock management techniques, their attitude towards cattle and land. And like 1950s projects, which were also very large scale, it involved a loss of land for farmers. And a Maasai friend explained to Dorothy, at first things went well, but then, and I'm not sure why, if the government ruined it or the project contract just ended, but suddenly the few things that we had received, like veterinary medicines and the veterinary centers, were stopped all at once until now. So the project did not connect itself to the future of the place where it was. For a while, people had veterinary medicine, then there was none. And integrated large-scale rural development didn't work. So part of what people learned was, or they saw in it, that it had been very much a top-down imposition. And that led in the 1980s to a focus on participatory development. So there was something that people learned. Consultation is important. Development is not an activity that should be done to people. People should be doing it. That's good. And another thing that arises in the 1980s is the capabilities approach. So what happened is participation absolutely becomes part of the rhetoric of development and part of the criteria of development. But a lot of this participation is actually coercive. And when I was taking life histories in Uganda for my most recent book, people told me, someone said, you just have to learn what the words are, and then you say, I'm doing that thing. And that worked. He said, you just have to learn the vocabulary. It changes every few years. And the depth to which a move towards participation became a kind of a manipulation of people to participate in a particular way. I could tell stories, other people could tell stories. But I don't have time. Ask me. But one element of participatory development, which is manipulation of people, obviously, it's not asking the question, why aren't these people getting to decide for themselves, decide what they want to do? Or if we perceive a kind of passivity here, what is the cause of that passivity? But also creating arenas in which people were supposed to show up and show that they were participating had the effect of requiring people to use their time to show up in places to show that they were participating. And if time is one's most scarce resource, a consequence of participatory development was that it took people's time without leading to sustained economic dynamism. And there's classic research on this by Sarah Berry. So participatory development, again, is really well-intentioned, but again, it's out of time. There isn't a recognition of the consequence of these actions is this in the present and in the future. The 90s decade is a turn towards trade liberalization and privatization, getting the price right, releasing inner entrepreneurs, getting market regulation out of the way. And we could make the same observation about that it's dissociated from the past. There's a neighborhood of Kampala that isn't known on a map in this way, but people who live there call it money is sweet. And so when I was working on this most recent book, I interviewed an older person there, and he told me that this neighborhood is called Money is Sweet, not because of 1990s entrepreneurs whose inner entrepreneur had been released, but because in the 1880s, it's at the top of a hill. And people who realized that the soldiers who were living in the city of Kampala then to support the British needed food. And so people began to carry food in to sell it, to basically to trade with these soldiers for the cloth that they were paid. And when you reached the top of the hill, you were sweating and you were tired, but you said money is sweet before you went down the hill to engage in entrepreneurial activity in the 1880s. So the question might be, why in 1990 do people think that Ugandans need to be, or other people need to be taught about the value and the utility of small-scale trade when it had been there all along. So we see, let me say just something about the Millennium Development Goals. In a way, we can see in the Millennium Development Goals a turn back to the state, a turn maybe back to larger scale initiatives. And in fact, the Millennium Villages that were part of the Millennium Development Goals look a lot like the 1950s. So there's development out of time there, because people aren't asking, is this, how does this thing that we're doing connect to what people were doing 30 or 40 years ago? But another element of the Millennium Development Goals is they're much, much less ambitious than the development aspirations in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, the idea was it was called the development decade, because the idea was it would take what was then called the third world countries 10 years to catch up. But the expectation was they would be industrialized, they would be rich, they would be creating prosperity for their citizens in the same way that countries in the North were doing. By the early 20th century, the goals are, we'll have less poverty. And we'll have less poverty, obviously, is a much less ambitious goal than we'll have prosperity for everyone. Okay, so I've now reached the end of the first section of my talk. And what I've tried to show is when we look at development, and of course I've generalized, but when we look at development, we see that it's an example of our sort of our contemporary habit of thinking and acting without placing what we're doing in time. And I do want to acknowledge that there are many efforts in process now and over the years of trying to make development efforts more effective. The entire field of development evaluation, the notion that one should, in planning a project, articulate a theory of change. You know, like basically a theory of change is sort of a way of saying, explain why this is worth doing. And that's a way of putting something in time. But I think development as an enterprise could be characterized like neoliberal economics or other things as something that we do without making an effort to place ourselves in time very carefully. And I think the reason for that is it's too hard. If we really place ourselves in time and ask, what will be the consequences of our actions? Or how do our actions connect to what created these conditions in the first place? It's just going to be too hard. And let me say something very quickly about the too hardness of this. If we let's think about what makes a farm family prosperous. So if we imagine a rural area and we imagine the economic unit as a family farm, and we ask, we look at that family farm and we see that the members of the family are there. Maybe the aspiration is to get one son or one nephew to emigrate to send money home. So the family itself has given up on the prosperity of the family farm. And even maybe institutions around have given up on the prosperity of the family farm. But it's really important to keep in mind that this is not true through all of time. The unit of the family farm has been a source of prosperity for communities and even a source of prosperity for nations. So what happened? If we want to figure that out, of course, the specific story is different in different places, but one way we can locate it in time is the reciprocity of man and nature and the way farmers used nature to generate farm inputs. That gets broken in the late 19th century with what's called the metabolic rift and the bringing into farming of forms of fertilizer and land renewal that didn't come from the farm itself. So that's a change in the late 19th century. But then if we want to think about the labor source of the family farm and how relationships among members of a family stopped working for the benefit of the family. And we can see that happening in the United States in about the 1940s. We can see it happening at different points in time in the late 19th and 20th century. That also is related to industrialization. If we want to think, so family labor was one of the sources of the prosperity of a family farm as a unit. Another was reciprocity between the farm as a unit and the community as a unit. And there were institutions that made that happen. That farm, community, local institutions network of relationships, we can see that kind of getting crushed over maybe a longer period of time, maybe 200 or 300 years in India, 150 years in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the fourth kind of relationship that gives this unit the possibility of prosperity is how is that farm and the nation that the farm is in relationship with other nations in the world. And those relationships changed over a few hundred years. So if we think man and nature, relationships in the family, relationships between the unit and the community, and relationship between parts of the world, those four sets of relationships can function in a way that makes a farm family prosperous, or they in different combinations, they can function in a way that makes it really, really hard for a family farm to exist. So if we're going to say, here we are, and we want our development activity to support the farm family, there's hundreds of years of crystallization of relationships that don't work. And it makes sense that we don't want to think about it. And it makes sense that we don't want to think about what will be the consequence. So in our community, we're going to have a rural school, and we're going to try to generate knowledge about agriculture, and we're going to make sure that our children are educated. Even if we can do that, all of these other sets of relationships may be conspiring against us. Of course, we don't want to think about it. So now we're at the last part of the talk, which is thinking about how durational ethics as a moral capability that we can cultivate. How does this help us? And just to recap what I mean by durational ethics, I mean cultivating an ethic of placing ourselves in time. Actions in the past made the present, and therefore we have to take actions in the present that connect to those conditions that created the present. And actions in the present make the future, and therefore we have to take actions that lead to the future we want. Because if we take actions that don't lead to the future we want, we're not going to get the future we want. I now want to talk about what I think are perhaps 5 elements of a durational ethic that can be cultivated. And the first is that durational ethics requires a multi-generational time frame. And I think this is super helpful because it took generations to create the challenge we face in the present. And if we say, it took us a really long time to get here, and it's going to take us a really long time to get out. But we're engaged in a long-term process of getting humanity from here to here. It's easier. We don't have to do it all before we retire. Another reason it needs to be multi-generational is that we live in the present. We inhabit the present. We inhabit the world the way it is. And what humanity really needs is probably beyond our ability to imagine it. But if we can place ourselves inside of a process, so like thinking about those 4 reciprocities and how they've dissolved, and we imagine humanity needs to relearn how to have reciprocities of man and nature in an industrial age. We need to learn that. We're here in learning it, and what we learn will get us to here, and then what people have learned by then will get us to there. If we can put ourselves in a multi-generational process of learning, then that gives our actions meaning, even though we can't solve the whole problem. And I actually just took myself to the second point here. We're learning to reweave a set of social, political, and economic relationships that can be characterized by interdependence and reciprocity. Because if we just take the example of the family farm, it can be prosperous with reciprocity. But how we create those complex sets of relationships that can build that reciprocity, and how we do it in a world that is as connected in all of the ways that the world of the present is connected. That's something we have to learn how to do, because how you have rural urban reciprocity in an age of instant communication and global movement of goods is something we don't know. And in fact, the global movement, when food began to move, when food became a commodity that could be grown in the Great Plains of the United States and sold in England, or grown in India and carried out of India and sold someplace else, that new technology was part of what eroded relationships of reciprocity. But does that mean reciprocity is gone forever? Or does that mean we have to learn how to create reciprocities in a much more complex world? If we say, yes, we can learn how to recreate relationships that work for everyone, then we put ourselves in the process that is going to happen over generations. And by focusing on learning, we create conditions where people who come after us can build on what we're doing. Okay, so durational ethics requires a multi-generational time frame. It requires a focus on learning. It also requires, and it builds on, connection. And this is true about a lot of things about ethics. They have an effect, but they also require that effect that they have. So durational ethics requires connections among people. We have to see them. We have to see the relationship of ourselves with the past. We have to see the relationship of ourselves with people in the future. And we have to see the relationship of ourselves with other people around us, because what we want to do is really complicated, and it takes lots of people, and we can't do it without connection. But also, if we cultivate a sense of where we belong in time next to others, that's giving us connections. And if we evaluate our actions in terms of their long-term consequences, that means that creating solidarity with others is always going to be a good thing to do. Like you kind of can't lose by creating solidarity. I think durational ethics requires and builds humility. And I wanted to talk about this because I feel that the practice of development could use some, that we need humility to be a part of how development is done. So a mature understanding of the elements that create the present shows us that people in the past thought they were doing the right thing. The people who closed down the rural schools created by Ugandan farmers in the early 20th century because they weren't good enough. There were, before 1930, Ugandan farmers in the center of Uganda had started over 5,000 schools. And in the 1930s, the government stopped funding all but 218 of them because they said the quality of these schools is low. We should have high quality schools. They didn't do that to oppress people. They really thought high quality schools are better than mediocre schools. Let's just defund all of the village schools and only have good ones. They thought they were doing the right thing. The people who brought in green revolution technologies that impoverished farmers and they lost their land, they didn't do it so that peasants wouldn't have land. They did it because they thought it was the right thing. And I think this invites humility, because maybe we think we're doing the right thing, and in a generation or two, people will be, and they thought they were doing the right thing. So we need humility. And identifying who's doing the wrong thing in the past or in the present actually does not lead to the future that we want. Finally, and this is a point that Jane Geyer makes, is that durational ethics requires and builds fortitude and perseverance. And in her essay, she said she looked for explanations of taking action over time. And she found that in religious writing up to the 18th century, this idea of fortitude and perseverance to make things happen was there. And then sort of moving towards modernity, it kind of fell out. But that it won't be easy, that we have to struggle, that there can be consequences of what we do if we really make an effort to have an effect in the future. I don't think it's an easy thing, but I think it's an attitude that we can cultivate. And the example I had for that is friends of mine in Uganda trying to create work opportunities for urban youth, bringing agricultural products into the city that need processing. But I think look at rural schools. In many parts of the world, you can see a history of rural schools where they're started, they fail, they're started, they fail, but people persevere. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize. I think development has been an endeavor that, like others in the modern world, is not rationally placed in time, with a recognition of the past creating the present and the future being built on the actions of the present. And perhaps it's hard to do because it's overwhelming. We put the Industrial Revolution on top of 300 years of building unworkable relationships. And then we've spent the last century building out a world that is ever more divided and unworkable in fundamental ways. And then we want development activities to fix it. It's hard. But we can cultivate a capacity for durational ethics, for putting ourselves in time. And if we aspire to put ourselves purposefully in time, that I think it will make our development efforts better. And I think it will make our development efforts more meaningful to other people and to ourselves. And elements of that are that it's multi-generational, it's built on learning, it requires and builds on the cultivation of connection, it requires humility, and it requires humility, and it builds on humility. And it requires and builds on fortitude and perseverance. I think if we look, we see in the world endeavors like this on a large scale and on a small scale. And just one that I would suggest people might look at is Via Campesina, the peasant farmers movement. So I hope this has been thought-provoking, and I'm very eager to hear people's thoughts.
Thank you so much, Holly. This really has, I'm sure it's stimulated everyone, opened windows in our minds which we didn't know existed. I'd encourage everyone to please share your comments and questions on the Q&A box. There are a few questions. Oh, they're piling up. Before going to the questions, I have one of my own, which I'll be selfish enough to to ask you at the beginning. So, Holly, I have this question about the nature of the way we understand change, right? What we've seen with many of the examples that you shared is one of the challenges was that those who proposed the development plans and programs, they had a linear conception of how change would come about. In other words, you bring in the right set of inputs, you bring the right people, you put in everything together, and lo and behold, over a period of time, it gives you your expected result. How does one account for the very complex nature of the world we live in, and a world which, with technology, with the shrinking of distance, and it's just becoming more and more complex. So there are multiple feedback loops, which those who initiate, even with the best of intentions, they somehow are just not able to take into account, because those consequences only become apparent over time. So does moving forward with a plan still make sense if there is so much complexity? For example, all the good folks who got the Green Revolution going were trying to cure the problem of starvation and food shortage. They had no clue, or hopefully they had no clue, of what impact it would have on the environment. They didn't know that governments in India would subsidize electricity so people could pump groundwater, which would then lead to a groundwater crisis. So things are so complex. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I think there's two things I want to say to this. One is we have to realize that we engage the world on different timescales. And then so I want to say something about that. And then I want to say something about knowledge generation in time and who does it. But I think it's something I didn't say, and I think it's really important, is we as human beings who care about the community that surrounds us, we have to operate in different timescales at the same time. So one is, like, right now, today, People have immediate needs. People need food and water. We need shelter when there's an earthquake all the time. We need security when there's too many guns around. And we conceptualize meeting those needs as relief, not development, because they're immediate. Nothing is developing. They're just, this needs to happen. And it's really important. There's another time scale, which is people in societies need the means to reproduce themselves in an orderly way. So for social reproduction, for the next generation to exist and be okay, we need systems of education that work. We need systems of healthcare that work. We need transportation so that we can act. We need markets. Those things are, like a 10 to 30 year time scale. And we just need to be making them so that we're okay and our children are okay. And most development activities focus on that level, which is perfectly fine, except we also need to think at a level beyond that, which is on a further time scale, how actions in the present affect the structures of society in the future. So some forms of development are looking at that level specifically, like radical education was looking to the far future, or land redistribution can be looking to the far future. But I think it's possible to engage. It's actually possible to engage each level of those timescales, thinking about the past and the future. So with famine relief, it used to be that grain grown in the Great Plains of Canada and the US would be flown to some place where grain was needed. And then people looked at that and said, oh, wait, when we do this, it disempowers farmers in the area because it reduces grain prices for them. So 10 years ago, the grain that was going to feed people in refugee camps in Kenya of Somalis, that grain was coming, all of it was coming from East Africa. So that's an example of there's an immediate need, but we're going to think about it with an eye to longer term consequences. I think it's obviously we can't think about everything, but I think we can pull out, we can pull the connections of ourselves in both directions. But a really important part of answering that question well is where is our knowledge of the effects of our action coming from? So if our systems of knowledge generation are narrow and elite, then we're going to have a much harder time. If our systems of knowledge generation are widespread and involve more people, then it's possible to get a feedback loop. So with the example you gave, people know really pretty quickly when their water supply is being ruined. It's not that it's a big mystery and then years later suddenly we realize that the water supply is ruined, right? I mean, maybe sometimes, but often people on the ground closest to that water know that bad things are happening with the water. So part of the challenge is like how do we open up knowledge generation so that more people in a society and more people connected to a circumstance are equipped to make the observations and have channels so they're actually listened to. And this is something that can be very performative and not work. One of the examples I thought of as I was preparing this was when I was thinking about participation, was an endeavor on the Kenya coast to involve fishermen in the care of the waters where tourists also come. You know, the tourists want to come and snorkel, so they want clean water. And fishermen are fishing in the water, so they want clean water. So there's this big meeting on the beach where everybody participates. But then the decisions got made in a smaller meeting in the hotel in English. There's no fishermen at that meeting. So there's a time thing and also a breadth thing.
Okay, so let's quickly look. We have a lot of questions coming in. Jagdish Kishore asks, how can the problem of participation be addressed? I think it is a modern problem. We did not have participation in the past when we had kings and priests. So it's, yeah, question is clear.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can't answer this speaking to Indian history, but I'm really pretty sure that I'm quite sure that in an African context, there was both kings and lots of community level decision making. So, you know, we would have to look carefully at the past. But I think it's a myth that people never thought for themselves and they never took care of themselves because they were always oppressed from the top down, and now we're going to make something different. I think that that kind of sounds like a rationalization of empire to me. So I guess one part of my answer would be, let's look to see what kinds of practices of community level decision making did exist. But then also, people are smart, and consultation is not a hard thing to learn to do. There's an element of capacity building, maybe. But it's capacity building that draws on our human ability to engage with others about well-being, our ability to be part of a group, our aspiration for well-being for ourselves and others, the human capacity to be just. You know, the things that genuine collaboration requires are qualities that human beings have. So it's a question of, are our systems of education fostering the sort of innate human capacity to do this or not?
Thank you, Holly. So the next question asks, according to you, what is a timeline for an attitudinal or ethical value taken up by a community to practice and transform into a habit or culture? Very important. And yeah.
I think that is a super, super interesting question. And I really am not trying to dodge the question, but I think it's something that we are learning about and we need to learn about. So other questions that would go around it would be, what does it take for people who are neighbors, or people who are in the same watershed, or people who have the same part of the same local economy? What does it take for a space of collective decision making to emerge? And if there is a space of collective conversation and collective decision making, what causes a group of people to coalesce around a collective aspiration? And I think there are places in the world where people absolutely know how to do this and they never forgot it. In North America, where I lived most of my life, there's a belief in urban planning that the way you get people to talk to each other is to cause a crisis. So there's this observation that the most vibrant communities in the United States are places where the government tried to put a highway through the middle of town and people fought it, or there's some kind of crisis that makes people talk to each other who didn't talk to each other before, and then those people begin to figure out about community. So the specific answer to the question is, I don't know, but I think it probably would be different in different places according to people's cultural resources. But I think there is, like this organic process of a group of people becoming able to articulate a collective aspiration, and we could study that process.
Okay. We have another question which asks, how can durational ethics avoid the tendency to solely or largely focus on demanding reparations for past oppressions experienced by people or those of certain occupations, which, while helpful in many respects, could potentially become an obstacle in framing a vision of development endeavors oriented towards a harmonious and just future?
Yeah. So how does a durational ethics avoid a focus on reparations? I think is making the connection on the other side to the future. So one of the really interesting things that African American communities did in the United States after the Civil War, where there was a promise of reparations, the promise of reparations, which would have been land and the means of farming the land. It didn't come through. But early 20th century African American communities, and maybe lack of political voice and the political climate was part of it, but what they focused on was building economic strength inside of communities that were segregated from the outside. They were curtained off, they were boundaried in cities. And the Black churches created cooperatives, cooperative stores. So if I realize that I deserve reparations, but I'm also thinking I do deserve reparations, but I'm also thinking, what actions can I take that will build the future that I need? I may keep open a conversation about reparations, but also focus on what can I do, or what can we do that creates the conditions that we want, which, because we can we can have more agency there than we can in relation to reparations may work better. So I guess what I'm trying to say is reparations has to be one strategy among others, because reparations is not going to create the world that we want. It's just going to do a little bit to undo the world that we didn't want. But it's a good question.
Okay, the next question we have is, how can we strive to protect development efforts from power structures, manipulation, and the desire for recognition, and instead create ways where individuals, communities, and institutions collaborate simply for the sake of development itself, with a sincere desire for progress as a civilization?
That's a really great question. Would you read it again?
How can we strive to protect development efforts from power structures, manipulation, and the desire for recognition, and instead create ways in which individuals, communities, and institutions can collaborate simply for the sake of development itself, with a sincere desire to contribute to the progress of civilization?
Wow, that's such a good question. And I think how does one maintain pure motives and an intention to engage constructively with others in a context where some of the players in that scene are self-serving? That's just a really big question. And maybe part of the answer is scale, because if we're trying to learn, like if we're engaged in a really long-term process of learning, there are things to be learned with institutions of the state. But then there are also things to be learned inside the family. And there are things to be learned inside a neighborhood. And there are things to be learned inside a school or an after-school group. And maybe if we're in a situation where we can see that some of the marquee, big focus development activities really exist to serve, there's a really large element of serving the self-interest of a group. Maybe we just do something else. Or what Sarah Berry said, you show up to the degree that you have to show up so that your part of the resources flows to you, but really invest oneself in another arena where we could have more control. It's a hard question. But part of the power of framing what we're doing as a process of learning that will take generations is it creates an immensely wide scope of action, because there's a whole lot that the human race needs to learn. And it's not possible for other people to set the agenda of our minds and what we want to learn.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. We have from Yasin a whole set of questions. Given the current state of individualism and consumerism, how do we foster such generational solidarity when people in the present would consciously and selflessly change their current consumption habits and renouncing their current comfort in order to connect with future generations? What would be their motivation?
Yeah. Individualism and what?
Consumerism.
Yeah. Well, maybe the answer to that is the power of example. And also, this is an arena where people need structures. I remember like 30 years ago, my daughter did her science fair project on recycling and who recycled what. Part of what she found was people who had access to paper recycling recycled paper, and people who didn't have easy access to paper recycling didn't recycle paper. So there's an element of, does this community have the structures it needs so that people can reuse, so that people can recycle, and building structures is one thing, then building motivation is another. But the power of example is really good for building motivation. So I think like this is sort of like human reality 101. We can't make other people do stuff, but we can make ourselves do stuff, and we can find other people who with us can think about our community in the present and our community in the future, and what kinds of things do we need to do for our community. And I think the power of example is really, I think the power is powerful. I also think that this is an arena where generational change is possible, where young people recognizing their aspirations for the environment in the future can say that and maybe have an effect.
So there are two friends who have questions about metrics. Srinivas, Rajaram, and Yasin. How can we really make durational ethics a reality if prosperity and development are still measured mainly in materialistic terms such as GDP growth, employment rates, inflation, and such traditional metrics? This is also the question that Srinivas Rajaram had.
Yeah, this is a great question. Because why do we measure GDP? We measure GDP because we think it's important. So and of course, what one then wants to talk about is the happiness index or the sustainability index. And I think those alternative measures have had an effect on helping people reframe what they're doing. I would love to see someone generate a measure of forms of solidarity. So, you know, like, and these four reciprocities that I talked about, one of the places that you can see a consideration of them is in Chayanov theory of, now I can't remember the title, theory of peasant something or other. Anyway, would it be possible to measure how connected are people in a community? For example, What if you like took a block, like a census block or something, and then randomly picked households out of it and asked those people, how many of your neighbors' names do you know? Or how many people in a 3-block radius of you do you talk to in a week? I think it would be possible to create measures that would measure progress in social solidarity. If we value social solidarity, we could measure it. We just have to think about we have to think about what things are important to us. Why are they important? If it's important for us to see progress in this arena, how could we measure it? Somebody should do it.
Okay, another question. How do we engage with history and find credible sources regarding the history of a people or a strand of endeavor, particularly when some cultures were oral and processes were undocumented? And what may be documented is tainted by an outsider colonial perspective.
This is such a great question. And I love it because I'm a historian. So there are forms of history that aren't in books. And one really interesting way to learn, to place ourselves in time in a way that opens our thinking is on a slightly smaller time scale, talking to older people, like getting older people to tell stories. And not every older person is going to be a good storyteller. There's some people, and one of the techniques, one of the field methods I would teach my students who are going out to do history research was talk to a lot of people, because not everyone holds on to the past in their mind. So you just keep talking to people until you find the storyteller person, and that will take you 3 generations back. How else do we learn history when so much of the history there is around us is told from a perspective that rationalizes power? Some people have to become historians and write good history. But where do you find it? I think we can read the history that exists asking questions. So if you're reading a history that seems to really rationalize oppression, look at how it's written. Look at the relationships that it establishes.
So because of we've overshot our time, I think we'll just take one more question, although there are more questions than we've been able to address. When we see some of the developments in the past which were aimed at development, they resulted in negative effects. Doesn't this make us pessimistic about the developments and uh, retard our work? What should we do to have more fruitful development?
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of worried when I looked over my notes for this talk that it was too negative a story. But I think what we should do is, I think we have to give people credit for trying, and we have to learn. And part of the story of the 20th century and the development decades up to now is people did really try, and they did learn. There's also a tremendous amount of self-interest, and then that self-interest has exactly the results that one would expect, which is it creates divisions. So I guess the answer to, we look at what's happened and we see a lot that didn't work. It has to be okay for other people to have made mistakes, because we're going to make mistakes. So we can't give up hope because human beings make mistakes. I think the way I think the way to be hopeful about engaging in this endeavor that we call development is to identify things that we want to learn and articulate how the actions we take will help us learn those things. And then at the end of what we do, even if it didn't work, we've learned something. So I mentioned cooperative stores in African American history. There's a lovely book called Collective Courage about them. And the author of that book makes the observation that many times the cooperatives failed, but even when they failed, the groups of people that had run them, and they used to have to study for a year, study accounting and management for a year before they were allowed to start. So even if they failed, but the people still had the knowledge that they had gained in doing it. So if we identify, if we frame our aspiration as learning, then we're going to succeed, because we're going to learn something.
Holly, one last question from Srinivas Rajaram. He asks, it's only those who can see the future can connect the past and the future. And it's not easy to do that in different domains. He says it takes people with very special capacities to do such things, spiritual and social capacity. What is your opinion? Is this something common people can do, or is it only for the gifted?
I don't know anybody who can see the future, but I think that the ability to reason and to say, like, I'm trying to do this, and at the end of my doing that, we'll be right here, or we're going to try to be right here. That's modest, and it's planning. And to say we'll be right here, but we as a community want to get over here. I don't think that's an individual capacity. I think it's a collective capacity. And I think that I don't know very many places where people are good at it, but I think it's something that groups of people can learn to do together. And maybe we learn to do it by trying and getting it wrong and then trying again. But if we don't try, we won't learn.
Thank you so much, Holly, for this really, I mean, thought-provoking and stimulating talk, and also to all our participants for really all your very profound questions, which really, I'm sure it taxed Holly's
Yeah.
It took all her effort to really think through those really deep questions, and thank you for these questions and comments. And I think there are a few which we were not able to take up due to a lack of time, and I apologize for that. Anyway, we look forward to getting together again for our next lecture, and I'd like to thank everyone, especially Holly, but also all the participants on Facebook and on Zoom, for making this a very thought-provoking and fruitful lecture.
Thank you.
Friend.
Arash, will you send me the questions?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll send you the ones which we couldn't take up.
Okay.
So you can respond to them and we'll email it to.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Take care. Yeah.